Should I start over? Okay, great. No worries. Sorry for the technical issues. My name is Brian Burgess-Limon. I'm a director at VestEd. Thank you for joining us today for this panel on LGBT inclusion and financial services. Our guest today is Lorenzo Fione. He was born and raised in Milan, Italy, and he graduated with a bachelor's from the Politecnico di Milano in computer engineering. He then moved to the States to pursue his MS in computer engineering at University of Texas at Austin. After graduation in 2005, he co-founded an innovative startup that was developing a natural language search engine, which was later acquired by Microsoft in 2008 in order to strengthen their own Bing platform. Lorenzo is also a Tony Award-winning and Drama Desk-winning theater producer who has produced hits such as Hadestown and The Inheritance, and he co-created and co-produced Allegiance, the Broadway musical starring George Takei and Lea Salonga. And he also directed and produced the 2016 film adaptation. Lorenzo is the managing director of Gangels and co-founding chairperson of Start Out, two groups supporting and empowering LGBTQ+ leaders in venture capital and financial services. And he's been named by Business Insider as one of the most influential LGBTQ people in tech. So Lorenzo, you're an engineer, an author, an activist, a producer, a director, and an investor. That's a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you went on this journey from being a computer engineer to being a serial entrepreneur?
Yeah, so I often joke that I don't really think that there was much of a plan in doing the things I did. I think that, part of what I've discovered throughout both my educational journey and sort of my early professional career is that when I saw opportunities to learn and apply what I had done or learned in the past to new sectors, work with new interesting people, I typically kind of underestimated the risk and the cost and sort of overvalued the experience and what that could be, which led me to sort of make choices that often seemed strange or unadvisable to others, sort of leaving cushy jobs with good salaries for starting companies with an uncertain future, or moving from a career that seemed, sort of going into a growth and direction to sort of restart in an industry that I had never worked in. But each and every time there was something that motivated me very directly. And really interestingly, and something that I've only really been able to discover and realize a little bit with hindsight, is that there is an actual thread and a connector, between all of these things. And one is really tied to my own passion and abilities and talents. And the other is sort of a little bit more externalized in things that happened to me. So the first thing is that I would say, while people often assume that the job of a theater producer or a theater writer or an investor or an entrepreneur are so different, I often kind of think back about what connects them, and I really realize that the talent in being a great communicator and telling a really great story and connecting with your audience at an emotional level to sort of enable them to see the world through your eyes and through your lens is really what gets people to join companies, invest in companies, clap at stories and feel emotionally raptured by theater, as well as learning by those. And I think that there is an absolute connection, in the fact that ultimately that skill has allowed me to sort of move from one environment to another, while at the same time sort of really realizing that the second most important thing is to surround yourself with absolute domain experts and great people that you can learn from, and that you can also offer a new perspective to, that comes from having inhabited completely different environments and different set of problems. The second thing that connects in a more direct way the specific choices I made, the specific projects I've worked on, the companies I've started, the organizations I've worked on, is actually something that happened not too long after I arrived in the States. Just a few months after I arrived in Texas, I got to experience as a recently arrived immigrant, September 11 and the attack on the towers. And that experience was one that kind of caused one immediate and one more latent change in how I perceived sort of both the world and the kind of things that I wanted to do. On one hand, in a sort of a little bit of a cliche movie-like way, it kind of forced me to own my own identity and come out of the closet. I came out as a gay man right around that time, just realizing life is short, and a lot of the barriers and the challenges that may exist. Some of them are real, some of them are made up in your head. What are fears? What are realities? Ultimately, it's only by confronting them that you can sort of move on and live your life as your best self. And the second thing kind of became apparent a little bit later, but was kind of started by being able to sense how the temperature around even the word immigration and immigrant completely changed overnight. And even speaking from the privileged tower of a white guy from Europe, you could still see how all of a sudden everything around you could change, on a heartbeat by decisions you had no part in, and you could see how other groups were being treated and referred to and spoken about in the aftermath of September 11th. And the massive sort of obvious impact of that to me became apparent a few years later, after I had built my first company, PowerSet, and had raised a whole bunch of money, learned a whole lot about a venture capital sort of ecosystem, built a terrific team. I was faced with new choices and new things to do, and I really decided to do two things. One was I started a nonprofit called Start Out, as you mentioned, out of my own experience and that of several friends and others who were LGBT entrepreneurs and for whom there was no network, no support, nothing, as I remember them saying, nothing they could see there to gain from coming out to their investors and their boards and their employees, while they fully understood what they were risking and what they had to lose. And Start Out is great pride for me. We created an organization that now 12 years later has 18,000 plus members, just received a fantastic grant from JP Morgan to continue its work in analyzing and data-driven creation of data that basically supports the economic impact of LGBTQ and diverse entrepreneurs. And that also gave way in my career to Gangels. But the second other thing that happened was completely by random circumstance and happenstance, I got to meet in one evening in a theater the actor George Takei, whom I recognized from the Star Trek series as Lieutenant Sulu, and who happened to tell me the story of growing up as a child in the internment camps in America after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and having been imprisoned with his family for close to 5 years for no crimes, having lost pretty much all of their property, all of their livelihood, for the only guilt of looking like and having descended from the people the US was at the time at war with. And which belied an enormous amount of sort of discrimination and racial prejudice and lack of leadership. And those themes were ones that really resonated with the kind of experience I had observed and still felt the remnants and echoes from September 11. And as a crazy entrepreneur that I am, I was there with a good friend of mine who is also a talented composer, and we're like, this is a great story, would make for a fantastic Broadway show. And we decided that we would write and produce a musical with George Takei in it. And as crazy as that sounds, we did, and brought it to Broadway a few years later. And I'll stop this with saying one thing. If that was one project and Start Out was another and Gangels is another, and then even shows, as you mentioned, that I've had a part in, like Slave Play or The Inheritance, there is a theme that really I have now realized is what motivates me the most. And it's the idea that creating opportunities for representation is probably the most powerful force towards encouraging progress and social change from the folks and from the people who that change is going to affect the most. And it's only when you see the world that you envision or you would dream of through the eyes and the experience of someone who looks like you or has had the same challenges and experiences as you do, that you find the courage to go out and act and take action towards making that vision a reality. And so with Allegiance, certainly, but with Gangels and Start Out, and even with one of the shows that I'm currently in the process of co-writing and producing, the idea of telling stories of underrepresented and elevating those voices and giving opportunities to those who, for whatever systemic reasons, have not had those opportunities up until that moment is a really powerful way to help create a better world.
And you know, it's really, I enjoyed reading your biography just from a personal perspective and seeing all of the kind of pivots you took. My grandfather had started his own business and joked that you have to be a combination of naive and really idealistic to start your own business, because if you knew what was ahead of you, a lot of times you just say no to it. But you know, you've done this over and over again and been successful at every turn. I think most people would feel like selling their company to Microsoft would be kind of the apex, but you kind of keep moving forward, and it's a really amazing journey to look at.
I really wouldn't say I've been successful at every turn. And you know, one of the things that is really interesting is to reframe success and failure in a way that ultimately amounts to a net positive for what you want to do and how you want to live. Like, you know, shortly after PowerSet and while I was working on Start Out, and you know, in the very early days of Allegiance, when it was kind of an idea but not much of a job, I started another startup, an idea that I think was awesome then, potentially still really great now. It was a company, a startup called Artify, that was the idea was to basically allow to bring real modern contemporary art from great visual artists in the spaces of consumers and companies as a service, as opposed to, you know, a property or an investment. And I think it was awesome. We called, you know, the Netflix for art or what have you. You know, it was the beginning of the gig economy and sort of transient idea of what property and possession was for the millennial generation. But it didn't work out. We raised an initial round. We didn't understand nearly as much about our customer persona as we thought we would. We encountered lots of logistical challenges that we hadn't quite anticipated, and it took us a while to solve. And by the time we actually did take that time to solve those, which we did, the economy had turned and it was really hard to raise another round, and we didn't have the metrics to support it, and decided that we would shut down that company. So that's certainly not a success, but yet a great experience I cherish. And then Allegiance is also not really a success in a way that many people would define success. And this is really interesting and a big moment of learning for me, because it took me a while to gain that perspective. We built a show, we opened in San Diego, we were the most successful, profitable production the Old Globe had ever produced in its entire, 100-year history, which was, you know, galvanizing and awesome and fantastic. And, you know, we are on a path towards Broadway, and we have multiple Tony winners in our cast. And George Takei is, in the meanwhile, you know, we helped him become a social media phenomenon and all of that. But we opened on Broadway 4 weeks after Hamilton did. And, you know, we lasted about 4.5 months. Like many of the shows that opened, original shows that weren't long lasting or big properties that year. And, you know, there's also opinions that people can have. Well, it wasn't a good enough show or whatever it is, but we opened on Broadway, which is kind of like competing at the Olympics. And we didn't win gold, we didn't place, but we had 120,000 yearly, matching the number of people who actually had been interned in camps in America come through and see the show in person. And then we got to make it into a movie, which many more hundreds of thousands of people around the world got to see. But it still isn't a financial success. people who did it thought they maybe would become a Hamilton and Wicked and Les Miserables, but they were doing it for many reasons, including the idea of making sure that those stories were being told and that legacy remained. And if you measure your return not on just the investment, but also on the impact that you make, just a different kind of ROI, then yes, then it is a success and something that I could not be more proud of. But it's really interesting to not kind of automatically, I think, assume that everything has to be a source of wealth or financial success in order to be a plus in the books.
You know, I did not remember that it only played for 4.5 months, because it impacted the cultural conversations around Japanese internment. I mean, it was all over the news and people were talking about it, and it really elevated the discussion in a way that made it very real. And so from that perspective, it just seems like when you can influence the conversation that big, then you've been successful.
I mean, I certainly, I'm happy about the impact. I couldn't be more proud, but you know, people hoped that it would be a commercial success, and it wasn't.
And do you feel like you connected with, like, your experience as a gay man helped you connect with George's story when you met him?
I mean, I think that my experience as a gay man and having, you know, having felt that inside outside sort of tribe experience throughout my adolescence and my young adulthood kind of connects you with the experience of the marginalized in many ways. But often, you know, I can't pretend to do so, to connect with that experience the same way, say, that a gay man of color would, or that a gay woman would, or that a trans person would. So, you know, it's a faceted community with very different intersections of privilege and lack thereof. And, you know, I think that George became dear friend. He actually ended up officiating my wedding. So my marriage to my husband, George, was actually the officiant. He's a member of my family. And I certainly connected with them through both our desire for that story to live and be told because of what I had experienced, but also because we both even though we've lived in drastically different decades, when the fight for gay rights was completely different stages, there was certainly a kinship that, much like the whole idea for Start Out, is when people understand the kind of challenges you've been through because you can relate to them, you're so much more likely to connect creatively and energetically with them and help them. And, you know, I think that is the entire reason for something like Start Out and then later the Gangels to exist.
So I'll use that to pivot over to finance. I mean, I could talk about Broadway all day, but we're here to talk about financial services. Can you tell me a little bit about how?
What? Sorry.
Genesis. Go ahead.
No, I don't know if you're there. You go.
Oh, you're there. Then tell me a little bit about the genesis of Startup and then how Startup works to combat discrimination in the workforce. Yeah.
So literally Startup was a random conversation with a few friends who, you know, I remember three of them. I was talking about our, mutual experiences in starting and running a company, and they all were out. They were not out. They were out, sort of privately and with their friends. And, but they made it a big point of sort of circling around or eluding the questions or not sort of meeting that when it came to their boards, their investors meeting pitches with their companies. And it always struck me, and, I was in a different place where I had decided that door was slammed behind me, but they were always kind of like, not really clear on the fact that this was weighing on their minds in a way that was making them ultimately, I think, less able to focus on building a great business and surrounding themselves with people for whom their identity was not going to be a minefield down the road that they always had to tiptoe around. And also with other friends who we realized, there was no support and no network. There were networks for women entrepreneurs, and there were networks for other affinity groups tied to ethnic origin or race, but there wasn't. This was something that nobody had done. And part of the question was also around, well, does it need to be? Does it need to exist? And it came largely from a hunch at that moment, because we had nothing but anecdotal information and our own experience, and the fact that, in our conversations, like, well, if there were something like this, that would be really awesome. I would have liked to be a part of a group like that, and so on. So we started it. We basically literally between New York and San Francisco invited a whole bunch of people in like bars, and started it as a network, but really with the idea of pivoting it towards a platform that was both a networking, an educational platform, a platform for stories of successful LGBT entrepreneurs to be elevated and celebrated and told. And what became really apparent is, as we started putting this network together, not only that there was a need that was being recognized, and people actually were showing up, and events got created, and sort of pockets of people that started working together in creating programming also started to happen. But then the other thing is that we started to have the opportunity to look at the data in a more systematic way, and realize that much like the same statistics that affect entrepreneurs of color or women, when you look at the different percentages of people who do start businesses as a percentage of their overall micropopulation, let's say women who start businesses as a percentage of women, and LGBT folks who start businesses as a percentage of the LGBT community, those entrepreneurial drives, those groups are higher than the norm. But the capital that they receive is a minuscule fraction than the norm, and than what their straight or mainstream counterparts would receive. And then when you start compounding those identity, intersecting things like gender, non-binary gender, or trans identity, ethnicity with the membership within the LGBTQ community orientation, then those percentages become absolutely minuscule. And at the same time, and I love the work that Startup has been doing now with Socos Labs, and really putting that data to show, there is a website that is connected through the Startup website called the Startup Pride Equality Economic Impact Index. And it really shows the missed opportunity, the gap between the jobs that LGBT founded businesses have created, and the ones that they could create if they received the same type of support and capital than the mainstream, and the innovation gap measured in patent submissions and writing, as well as the overall economy, sort of venture economy boost, which is sort of funding gap that creates then the opportunity for that funding to turn into salaries and jobs and expenses and vendor expenses and so on. And that's really the proof, I would say, to the fact that hunch and that idea that sort of snowballed in this community of 18,000 people was rooted in a real phenomenon. And now with an incubator at Startup, the Growth Lab, that has started to mint companies, including one first unicorn company, it's now also a real engine for innovation and success. And so it's just a terrific thing to see. What was always missing, and sort of I'll just pivot very briefly into Gangels and how that came about, was the two founders of Gangels, which I am not, but I joke that while I won't take credit for founding Gangels, I'll take credit for the petri dish that incubated Gangels, because they met through the Startup Network. I met them, through that network, and they had this idea of an angel group of LGBT investors investing in LGBT founders. And much for the same reason, it felt like it was a missing piece of that equation, where if that support was being brought in an intentional way, that there was something positive to come from it. And I became one of their first investors. But the really interesting thing and pivot or expansion happened about 3 or 4 years ago, when I joined them as a full-time managing partner, one of their managing partners. And we realized that the mission that Gangels had, and this is where I was talking about representation and why it matters so much to us, but the mission was always that of using capital and using business as an instrument to affect a transformation of the venture ecosystem towards one that is overall more diverse, more inclusive, more representative, and more accessible to people, independent of the systemic networks that they may or may not have been part of either because of who they were, where they grew up, what they looked like, and so on. And we realized that if that was the mission and the problems or the shortcomings that venture still was affected by went beyond LGBT and still had issues with respect to binary gender representation, let alone non-binary and ethnicity and whatnot, that the best way to do what we wanted to do was to broaden it and to really focus on diversity while making sure that LGBT and non-binary gender was not being dropped from the diversity conversation, which very often was to the only benefit of binary gender and ethnicity. And so making sure that that was a part of it, but to focus on making sure that we would support diversity where diversity already exists, and that we would become a true intentional partner to help any organization where maybe diversity wasn't where it needed to be, or maybe where it was missing some element, or where it was about expanding and extending the definition of what an inclusive company looks like, that we could help them with hiring support, recruiting, board support, and all of the ways in which we continue to help, including representing diversity on the cap table stack, which is a new way of thinking about the importance and the responsibilities that companies have. Companies can certainly help by hiring and building great teams that are inclusive. They can help with spending their money, in causes that are pushing forward equality in a number of different ways. But they can also sort of making the statement by making sure that it's not the same only groups of people that come from the insular financial, educational, and socioeconomic and racial backgrounds that have access to the opportunities to invest in the best companies and therefore benefit from that wealth creation vehicle. And so bringing new underrepresented classes of investors in the venture ecosystem, including in giving them privileged access to opportunities that would just simply not be open to them, is really valuable. And so Gangels, amongst other venture investors, is, for example, a founding signatory of a project or an initiative called the Diversity Term Sheet Writer Initiative, that is basically language that venture firms and entrepreneurs can adopt into their term sheets to basically expressly making room for diversity-based investors into their cap table stack.
Nice. And how do you make, so this will be a two-part question. How do you make the business case for diversity? Because the bottom line is frequently the bottom line. And then how do you feel that kind of diversity within corporate America benefits the larger LGBTQ community?
So first of all, I think that the way that you make the case for anything is with data. I always, I joke often that one of my favorite quotes, if not my favorite quote, is I think by the founder of Netscape, which is, if you have data, let's go with the data. If all you have is opinions, let's go with mine. But it is, data is really out there, and people who do not want to admit or look at the data are just simply closing their eyes. There is now a lot of studies, primarily done in the public market, that basically look at companies that are competitive and largely in the same class, but where leadership, especially at senior levels and boardrooms, show significantly more representation of underrepresented minorities, and you have them outperform the competition on all financial parameters time and time again. And so it's now pretty established that it isn't just the right thing to do in an abstract way, it's also the smart thing to do for the business. It also is something that needs and has and can change with the times and evolve, because companies and organizations aren't abstract things. They're made of people, and those people have needs, desires, opinions, political views, and they evolve as the world evolves. And companies are smart enough now to realize that if they want to attract and retain the talent that they need, they also need to they realize the value of aligning themselves and their own values, both internally and externally, with their own stakeholders. It's really, if you look at things that have happened to companies like Equinox or others, where you have like misalignment with stakeholders within your cap table stack in that moment, or policies with respect to companies that donate or whose leaders donate to certain causes and suffer real consequences with their own, because they are on one hand trying to be appealing to employees and customers and whatnot, and on the other hand they're expressing views or values that are misaligned with them. And so that's the second reason why it's smart for companies to do so, to be more inclusive, because the market demands it in a way, meaning the market of talent, the market of customers, and so on. And then the third one is, it's also the necessary thing to do, because especially say if you want to become a public company, you now have exchanges that will require a certain level of representation and minority representation on your board before you can actually be listed. And so we often explain that the work that we do with our portfolio companies, where we help them identify, qualify, vet, and bring on board independent board members from underrepresented backgrounds, is also good sort of housekeeping if you are trying to, or your aspiration is to become a publicly listed company. And so all of these are just good reasons to believe that the same lessons that hold it true in the public sector will hold true in the private sector, and it is right, smart, and necessary to be truly inclusive.
You touched a little bit on rainbow washing, especially when you mentioned Equinox. At the same time, the company that was investing in fitness classes like Vogue fitness classes and things like that, they were also giving money to anti-LGBTQ causes. How do you what do you think about the kind of charge of rainbow washing in general, and how can companies be more authentic in the way they engage the LGBT community?
So, I think that there's a difference between true rainbow washing and sort of a grading scale of commitment that maybe is improving and increasing, and it hasn't made it all to all of the different parts of the way in which you consider the organization. To the benefit of Equinox, I want to say, I think the company was very inclusive. What they hadn't realized is, again, as the shift of times is happening, is that as stakeholders, consumers, employees, partners become more educated also around the entire chain of value that exists in venture, all of a sudden it's not just which customers you serve and how nice you are to those customers and inclusive. It's not just which companies which causes you donate, or do you participate in the Pride Parade or not. It's also, hey, who is benefiting from the value that we as customers deliver you, that we as employees deliver you, and who is sitting on your cap table, and how much of your company is owned by who. Then all of a sudden started to matter, and it's just another way of looking at the overall sort of flow, and say, much like governments want to know where does the money come from when they are trying to sort of figure out, know your customer or so. Employees now want to know where, if I work hard and I succeed and I make my company succeed, who is benefiting? Is there an inclusive group of communities that can benefit from this value that I'm creating? Or am I, contributing to the sort of the nefarious, or the things that I don't agree with respect to how wealth is allocated, or where does it go, or I always just speak about value alignment, right? Are my values as a stakeholder aligned with the ultimately the values of the company, in where does the wealth and the value again created flow to? So but there is such a thing as rainbow washing, which is probably when this is done intentionally tongue-in-cheek, right? You're really sort of doing it for no good intention, but for improving your bottom line because you believe that that's a smart, sort of short-term decision, while at the same time, holding truly, decisions that are against that, the advancement of those same policy. That is always, it's not just rainbow washing. It's true for racial equalities and other ways in which sort of the equity and for discussion is conducted. And we should all be on the lookout for that and make sure that, each one of us, if we are of that opinion, don't participate in that system. And we do look out for that. But I also want to say that when it's the first category, when a company is making a first well-intentioned gesture, a first step, they don't need to be perfect. And it can be superficial without being inauthentic. Because guess what? We say you can't have the conversation unless you're inside the room, unless you've been invited in the room and the door has been open. You just have no chance of having any impact in telling that story and in changing those hearts and those minds. And so if the door is just cracked open and all you get is the company participated in the Pride Parade, well, that is an opening for, maybe bringing investment from a diverse group of investors, or bringing minority-owned vendors into the equation so that they can bid and earn more contracts. And all of those steps can really happen incrementally. It doesn't have to be all in one. And so on that respect, I'm sort of against the culture of saying, if you're not perfect, if you don't do everything absolutely right, then you're the worst. Then you should be completely, canceled. But it is to realize that it's a process, and then it's a growth, and it's an incremental process. And preaching to the choir helps nobody. And so it's only getting outside of the echo chamber is to actually have those conversations with people and with organizations that are showing that they would like to do that work and make the gesture, that you start to have the opportunity to make change.
I was in-house at a public company that the CEO wanted to participate in World Pride. I think somewhat because his daughter wanted to be on a float, but it led to a lot of internal conversations, especially with the reaction from some of the employees that got us to actually look at getting on the HRC Equality Index. And that led to changing some of the insurance policies and some of our vendor management policies. And it was interesting that just this drive to want to have a float in World Pride opened up conversations. We ended up starting an LGBTQ ERG, and it really impacted the organization from the inside. And so I agree with you that taking those incremental steps is important. And I have to say, as a teenager, I always looked forward to seeing all of this, like which companies were doing what during Pride, and seeing those rainbows. I was a teenager a long time ago, but seeing those rainbows then meant a lot to me. I do think companies have to do more now than that, but those steps are really important, and I think for people to see. Can I ask you how COVID has impacted the work that you're doing with Start Out with Gangels and the relationship, the network at large?
Yeah, I mean, it always generates a little bit of a guilt feeling in me, because both Start Out and Gangels have benefited greatly. They are definitely at the COVID winner side of the spectrum, while lots of devastation, economic and otherwise, is being brought upon so many other people, and disproportionately on underrepresented and marginalized communities in general. But the ability, for example, just to speak about Start Out, sometimes you are thrown into decisions that you maybe would have been really cautious about making. And once you're thrown into those and you make it work, you realize you end up on the other side of the tunnel in a much better place. And that's what happened to Start Out, which up until COVID had worked, extra hard to maintain its geographic connection to chapters to events that were in person, to that authenticity in networking and in connection, which is nothing to be, sort of frowned upon. I mean, it's great. It was obviously a recognition that people want to connect in person, and there's a lot of value from it. But it keeps you from engaging with all of those other people who would benefit from your services, your expertise, your knowledge, your connections that are not in those places. It's sort of, I was just reading an essay yesterday around the concept of reality privilege, and, sort of whatever reality you may be in, geographic, economic, and so on, just causes you to potentially have enormously higher access and opportunity and privilege over other people who could potentially benefit from so many of those things. And this is an argument to say there is a true value into laboring towards creating virtual experiences, whatever that means now and whatever that will mean in the future as technology advances, so that we equalize some of that reality privilege, like as opposed to virtual privilege, so virtual reality. And it was really fascinating for Startup, because all of a sudden it gave it the opportunity to become a truly global organization with members who would sign up and services that would now be provided virtually and online, and with virtual events and attendance to events. And, as we've all discovered in our remote work, once it's both culturally accepted and it's the reality that everybody has to deal with, the experience is not perfect, and it's not replacing being in person, but it's pretty darn good already. And there is so much that you can get done when you don't have to move from place to place or sit in traffic and so that gave Startup a really fantastic propulsion. And the same thing happened for Gangels, which was combined by both the growth, in terms of membership and opportunities for people to join as a syndicate, but also the other side of that equation, which is venture has experienced just an enormous boost from COVID, because a number of things. Capital needed to go somewhere, and lots of companies are started in moments of crisis. And that same phenomenon of remote work that facilitated growth of Startup facilitated entrepreneurs and investors to all of a sudden pitch to 10 many more people, and raise money without having to travel from one place to place. And that has caused enormous liquidity in the process. Sort of the fluid way in which then the venture asset class has grown has been just remarkable, as well as companies that are specific to the venture asset class that have been also benefiting from the technological and sort of distribution revolution that has come, acceleration, I should say, that has come from COVID. Anything from logistics and delivery to online shopping to video conferencing, Zoom, and all SaaS and technology services. So, in a little bit of a guilty state, I'm like, it has been a really fantastic year for both Startup and Gangels.
I know somebody who's at Trevor Project and said that a lot of kids who normally would not be able to come to Trevor events have been able to come to these virtual events. And maybe they couldn't come, or maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable going into a room with a bunch of strangers, and that it's really opened up a new way of interacting with people that wasn't really possible before. So I had a client, a nonprofit client once, who said that the goal of any mission-driven organization is to put itself out of business and not really be needed anymore. So what would that mission accomplished look like for Gangels and Startup?
And for Startup, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's true, although most organizations that are mission driven realize that they've accomplished one mission, and then they now can expand and continue that path towards a world they envision, broadening it. I remember very specifically how I would answer that question 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And I think we're not quite there for Startup, but we're getting really close, which was something to the effect of, like, if I can walk down the street and ask the everyday person, hey, name an openly LGBT sort of founder or leader of a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company. We obviously got there with Tim Cook, we certainly need more than a gay white man to be in that position, but the same can be said around positions of leadership in the entrepreneurial world, and in the venture ecosystem for both startup, which is very specific to the LGBTQ community, although at the focus on the intersection identity, as well as for Gangels that really looks at the ecosystem in general and say, is leadership equitably distributed across all ways in which all the forms and shapes and colors and hues of the rainbows that humans come, so that those roles and those opportunities create representation and visibility for others who may seek to emulate it, so that opportunity becomes as equally distributed as talent might be and as innovation might be.
And the T part of LGBT has been kind of in the background for a long time, and those conversations, as we've achieved marriage equality and other rights, those conversations are now coming to the fore, and people are a lot more aware of gender diversity now, and there are a lot more role models. But when you do a search, I was looking to try to find if I could find a trans finance influencer, and really couldn't. I saw a lot of models and actors and things like that. How do you feel about, and how do we increase representation of trans leaders in business and in finance?
Well, I know I am hyper focused on this. I am in the process of completing our first project, a first edition of a project called the Gangels 100, which should be, released probably within 2 to 4 weeks. It's a book including 100 profiles of amazing LGBT venture-backed entrepreneurs all around the world, and there is really meaningful trans representation, both trans men and trans women. There is a hyper focus on being inclusive from ethnicity, from geographic origin, national origin, and all that. Because again, it's really about that representation. I am proud to say Gangels is an investor. I can't tell you in how many, but well over 20 trans-led founded companies, which is, of course, a small piece of our portfolio, which is now about 700 companies. But I would struggle to find any organization that can even say they are investors in more than 2 or 3, if at all. It's really about knowing that there are people who are building great businesses and they are trying to solve real needs for their own community that up until now, people have shunned as being, well, I don't care about your community. So if you're building a product or a service, that's not something I want to be a part of. And this is I think it's a big shift. And I think it's realizing that there is value for all of us if we are encouraging both those stories and those successes to be seen and amplified, but also for those communities to be elevated by those products and those services to exist.
Thank you. You mentioned the book. I want to close out what's next? You've led a lot of lives. You've done a lot of things. What's next for you?
So I'm working on 4 new shows, which I'm very excited about. Maybe the most exciting is a new musical that I'm co-writing and producing called Indigo, which much like the others really focuses on an underrepresented story. And it's actually telling a story of neurodiversity. It's about a young woman with autism and sort of what her journey is with respect to her family and the families that she interacts with. And we hired and cast an incredible young woman who's on the spectrum for the role. And again, it's about, creating that opportunity for representation. I'm really focused on continuing to grow Gangels into something that really can make an impact in as many companies in the ecosystem as we can. Beyond that, I think I will continue to be as open to crazy ideas and new chapters as I've always been. I know that if someone at the right moment and the right time came to me with something that spurs the opportunity and the idea for something that I've never done, it'll probably have a really big appeal for me because it's really an opportunity for learning and growth.
Great. I really appreciate you taking the time today. This has been an interesting conversation. I knew it would be when I was reading about you, and I talk for a lot longer. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for the good work you're doing for the community as well. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Thank you so much for having me. Happy Pride.